HMS Campbelltown, a British destroyer from World War II. A ship whose story is so wild and action-packed, it puts some fictional books to shame. A ship which, for some bizarre reason, has an entry in the Paw Patrol wiki. Buckle up, ladies and gentlemen, because HMS Campbelltown's story is quite the rollercoaster, filled with heroic actions, unfortunate tragedy, and comedic incompetence. However, before we start, I am going to make an interesting decision, because I'm going to recommend a few videos you might want to watch instead. You see, judging by the fact that my notes are 29 pages long, I can already tell that this is going to be a long video. And let's be honest, not everyone has the time to learn every single minute detail about a random warship from World War II. Therefore, I'm going to recommend a few shorter videos, which I made in the past, which will tell the story while also respecting your time. You'll miss out on a couple details, but you'll have your life back, so you win some, you lose some. The first one, which is, yes, it is there, yes. The first one is a World of Warships video I made a couple of years back, which is perfect if you want to learn a bit of World War II history while watching ships blow up. And the second one is a YouTube short, which I filmed roughly 50 minutes ago now, so there's that as well. Have fun! And now that that's out of the way, let's dig into the story of HMS Campbelltown. HMS Campbelltown wasn't always called HMS Campbelltown. In fact, when she was first built in the United States in the city of Bath, Maine, she was originally called USS Buchanan. Construction began on the 29th of June 1918 and was undertaken by a company called the Bath Iron Works. The ship was launched on the 2nd of January 1919 and was only commissioned in service, or in other words, joined the US Navy 18 days later, which means that she had just about missed the end of World War I. For this reason, the USS Buchanan's interwar career was actually quite tame, with her seeing mostly service in the Caribbean and Pacific and not really seeing much action. Although my notes have revealed some interesting details, it seems that the American Navy couldn't decide whether they wanted her commissioned or not, because, well, she was decommissioned in 1922, and then she was recommissioned in 1930. And then in 1937 she was decommissioned again, and in 1939 she was recommissioned again, before being almost immediately put into reserves, which from my understanding means that they parked her on a dock and kind of just left her there in case they needed her later. Things were about to get interesting though, but before we do that I should probably start by introducing a major side character in the story of HMS Campbelltown. The 1920s and 1930s were an absolute golden age for transatlantic cruise ships, with many countries outcompeting each other to make the biggest, fastest and most luxurious ships. It's in this context that the French government started construction of their magnum opus, the SS Normandie. The SS Normandie was launched in 1935 in Saint-Nazaire, and it was so big that an entire new port facility had to be built to accommodate it. It was the pride of France, and to be honest, it really needed to be, because they put way too much money into it. The French government had subsidised 812 million francs into the project, which, by today's standards, amounts to 104,520,287 British pounds. The SS Normandie really was a magnum opus. She was the biggest cruise ship of her time, measuring 315 metres in length. To put that into context, the Titanic was only 269 metres in length. She was also the fastest ship of her time, with a record speed of 29.98 knots or 55.5 kilometers per hour. She won the Blue Ribbon twice, the Blue Ribbon being a prestigious award only given to ships who held the record for the fastest Atlantic crossing. On top of being the fastest and the biggest cruise ship of her time, she was also considered to be one of the most luxurious, with an infamous Art Deco style. And I'm not kidding here, right? She boasted a main dining room which was inspired by the Versailles Hall of Mirrors, an interior theatre with a complete stage, a 24-metre long, fully tiled swimming pool, glass panels by the French artist Dupas, and 400 uniquely designed first-class cabins. I am so sorry for the interior designer who had to make 400 different cabins. Where'd you get the... How do you do that? Anyway, the SS Normandy's glamorous career was put on pause when World War II broke out in Europe. The French company decided to keep her in the United States, specifically the New York Harbor, for safekeeping for the duration of the war. And this is where we're gonna leave it for now. You'll see its story becomes important later. Or at least, this is where we would leave it for now, if I didn't stumble across this random story which I have to share with you. Let's set the stage. It's the 22nd of June 1936. The SS Normandy was making a pit stop 1 mile off the coast of the Isle of Wight. She was using her onboard crane to unload one of the passengers' cars when suddenly, on the horizon, a British Blackburn Baffin appears. The plane belonged to a certain Lieutenant Guy Kennedy Horsey. Yes, you heard that surname correctly. The lieutenant was conducting a standard torpedo training exercise in the area, although it very quickly started to go a bit wrong. He approached, swooped in, came dangerously close to the SS Normandy, dropped his torpedo, and then failed to pull up. He collided with the SS Normandy's onboard crane and then crashed into the bow of the ship. Thankfully, no one was harmed, but the bomber itself was kaput, and the car the crane was transporting at the time was also destroyed. Unfortunately, our friend Mr. Horsey's day was not going to improve, because it turns out that the destroyed car belonged to Arthur Evans, who was a British Member of Parliament representing Cardiff South. In other words, he was his employer. Now, let's put ourselves in the shoes of our poor pilot here, because he just suffered the humiliation of a crash, destroyed his employer's car, and collided with the most famous ship of the time. Lieutenant Horsey was understandably having a bad day, but thankfully the ship's onboard band was there to cheer him up. Or at least they were there to pretend to cheer him up, because the song's name was Horsey Keep Your Tail Up. His surname was Horsey. Alright. Let's give him the benefit of the doubt. The song might not have been insulting, as the title suggests. In fact, I was able to track down the song, so we'll be able to find out together whether the song would have cheered him up. I'll leave you to decide. Alright, the Destroyers for Bases Agreement, signed on the 2nd of September 1940, had a strong impact on the future of USS Buchanan. Like most military and political documents, its wording makes it sound very, very complicated. Probably because it is. Although luckily for us, a simplified resume has been kindly provided in the form of a letter between Cordell Hull, the US Secretary of State, and a British ambassador, whom you can recognise by his really fancy title, the Marquess of Lothian. Now, some people may argue that the Destroyers for Bases Agreement was a little bit unfair toward the British, because they gave away quite a few things and didn't gain much in return. As we can see in the letters, where they state that naval and air bases in Newfoundland, Bermuda, British Guiana, these first three were free of charge by the way, the Bahamas, Jamaica, St. Lucia and Antigua will be leased to the United States for a period of 99 years, which means that they're still in possession of them, free from all rent and charges other than such compensation to be mutually agreed on to be paid by the United States in order to compensate the owners of private property for loss by expropriation or damage arising out of the establishment of the bases and facilities in question. In other words, the UK is pretty much lending those bases for free, although the United States does have to compensate if the bases get damaged. Basic landlord stuff, really. In exchange, the government of the United States will immediately transfer to His Majesty's government 50 United States Navy destroyers, generally referred to as the 1200 type. Now, being gifted 50 destroyers at the start of the Atlantic War may seem like a good deal, and you can argue it is, but there was a catch. You see, destroyers, much like tanks and pretty much any piece of equipment in the army, have a service life, which means that there comes a point when they're a bit old to be useful. When a destroyer reaches 30 years, for example, they tend to be reaching the end of their service lives. By the time you reach 40 years, you're kind of pushing it. During the exchange, USS Buchanan, which was one of the 50 destroyers sent to the UK through the Destroyers for Bases Agreement, was 22 years old. It didn't have many years left in it, did it? Still, 50 destroyers is 50 destroyers, and the United Kingdom kind of needed them. Besides, it was still a pretty generous offer considering the fact that the US had sworn to be neutral. We'll see how that goes. So the United Kingdom signed the agreement, meaning that the destroyers, including USS Buchanan, were now under British control. So USS Buchanan was handed over to Britain during the Destroyers for Bases Agreement, and was commissioned into the Royal Navy only a few days later on the 9th of September 1940. If we are to believe U-Boat.net, HMS Campbelltown's first commanding officer, or in layman's terms, captain, was selected on the day she was commissioned by the Royal Navy. This commanding officer was none other than Lieutenant Isaac William Trant Below, who, judging by his surname, really missed his calling as a submarine commander. Now, Lieutenant Below was born in the Winchcombe district in Gloucestershire in December of 1909 and joined the Navy as a cadet in 1927. USS Buchanan was the first ship he was ever put in charge of, and, as we shall see later, it really shows. USS Buchanan was taken to Devonport Dockyard in Plymouth on the 29th of September 1940 to undergo repairs in preparation for service under the Royal Navy. During this time, she was renamed to HMS Campbelltown after, well, two towns, one in Britain, one in the US, which both shared the same name. The next part is where things start to get both interesting and dubious. The interesting part will be self-explanatory because, well, you'll see when we get there, and the dubious part is mostly down to sources. I haven't found many sources which actually tell HMS Campbelltown's story from the following period of time. Which means that, historically, it's hard to tell whether it really happened. I, however, think it did happen, and once I'm done explaining what happened, I'll tell you exactly why I think it's plausible that it happened. On the 1st of November 1940, HMS Campbelltown had not yet completed her modifications or her sea trials, but she had already been selected to join the 17th Flotilla in Western Approaches, which is in Liverpool. Just one day later, on the 2nd of November 1940, Lieutenant Below crashes HMS Campbelltown into the SS Rezoid during sea trials and sustains minor damage. Now, the damage wasn't so bad that the ship sank. In fact, HMS Campbelltown was able to complete her journey to Liverpool regardless, but she still needed to undergo repairs upon her arrival. Now, you could say that mistakes happen, and perhaps I am judging Lieutenant Below a bit harshly for crashing his first destroyer on his first outing. But then again, only 5 days after HMS Campbelltown completed her repairs, Lieutenant Below crashed her again, this time into the British coastal trading vessel, the Fidown, sinking it. Now, clearly Lieutenant Below had already mastered the fine art of sinking vessels, because despite sinking the Fidown, HMS Campbelltown had not sustained enough damage to warrant going under repairs, and she was able to join the flotilla in early December. I'm going to give you a couple seconds to take a wild guess as to what happens next, alright? What else happened in early December? If you guessed HMS Campbelltown collides for the 3rd time in 2 months, then you'd be correct! Lieutenant Below crashed HMS Campbelltown into SS Comus on the 3rd of December 1940, and this time, the destroyer was not so lucky. She sustained major damage and had to undergo repairs until the 28th of March 1941. Now, before we move on, I did promise I would talk about historical accuracy, because as much as I would love for this story to be entirely correct, there simply isn't enough evidence to prove that. That being said, I still would like to argue that it did happen, and here's why I think it did. It's time for the nerdy bit. Don't worry, it's not too long. Now, let's start with the incident on the 2nd of November 1940, the collision with the SS Rizoy. Now first I need to prove that the SS Rizoy existed, which thankfully isn't too hard because it features on two pretty trustworthy databases. The first is WreckSite, which features a photo of the ship and a complete list of the crew during its final journey. And the second being the Kriegszähler Register... How do I pronounce this?
Kriegszählerregistret.
Kriegszählerregistret, which documents the lives of Norwegian sailors in World War II. Now, according to my research, the SS Rizoy was a Norwegian cargo ship built in 1918. It seems to have regularly operated on the southwest side of the United Kingdom during the war, before being bombed and sunk by enemy aircraft near Trevose Head, Cornwall. HMS Campbelltown's presumed route, going from Portsmouth to Liverpool, therefore crosses that part of the ocean, and so the collision is pretty plausible. The second collision happened on the 29th of November 1940 in the Mersey estuary. Now, you'd think that local newspapers would make a big deal about a coastal trading vessel sinking in the Mersey estuary, but strangely I couldn't find any primary sources stating its existence. However, the Fidown appears to exist in the National Archives BT389 catalogue, so it probably existed. According to my research, it was built in 1940 by Gould Shipbuilding and Repairing. It was a steel motor vessel designed for carrying cargo. She served briefly as a member of convoy FN222 in July of 1940 and sank in November during the collision with HMS Campbelltown. However, that isn't the end of the Fidown story, because she was raised and restored in 1942 before being broken up in 1972 when she was deemed just no longer useful. Granted, not all my sources for the Fidown are particularly trustworthy. Shippingandshipbuilding.uk is one of the few sources I found even mentioning the collision, and Google gives me a security warning every time I try to access it. Then again, inventing an entire history for one coastal trading vessel in World War II seems like a really specific lie, and I really can't think of a motive for it, so I don't see why it would be wrong. The third and final collision, the one on the 3rd of December 1940 with SS Comus, is by far my weakest one in terms of evidence. I have found not even a single source which proves the ship exists. The only sources even mentioning the collision are navalhistory.net, worldnavalships.com, and Wikipedia. Then again, I'd like to reiterate my previous statement. Who would lie about this? Whether you believe the collision happened or not, it is clear that something happened to HMS Campbelltown, because she went into repairs shortly after the incident supposedly occurred until the 28th of March 1941, after which she entered a new chapter in her life. Halfway through the repair process, HMS Campbelltown was lent to the Royal Netherlands Navy, which marked the end of Lieutenant Isaac William Trant-Billow's time in charge of HMS Campbelltown. He had failed to complete a single successful outing without crashing his ship. He was replaced by Commander William Harmson on the 17th of January 1941, who proceeded to actually drive her like, well, you know, a ship. Since she was now part of the Royal Netherlands Navy, HMS Campbelltown's title had to change, which is why for the purposes of this chapter, she's going to be referred to as HNL MS Campbelltown. Now it's important to note that her time under the Royal Netherlands Navy is actually poorly documented as well, with very few sources actually going into detail as to what exactly she did there. Because of this, this section relies heavily on only one source, navalhistory.net, the online database which actually lists every single convoy HMS Campbelltown was a part of. So let's dive into it. Between the 2nd of May and the 9th of June 1941, HMS Campbelltown escorted 6 convoys. This streak was eventually broken by convoy number HG063, during which she was damaged and had to go under repair. She resumed service on the 19th of June 1941. There is only really one notable event which occurred after she resumed service which is worth telling, and that is the incident on the 15th of September 1941. Let's set the stage. HMS Campbelltown was escorting convoy number OS006, which was departing from Liverpool and heading to Sierra Leone. The convoy was in the early stages of the voyage, west of Scotland in the middle of the North Atlantic. Suddenly, the destroyer received an SOS signal from a Norwegian tanker called the Vinga, which had suffered engine problems the day prior and therefore was trailing behind, exposed. When HMLMS Campbelltown arrived at the scene at 11:20, the crew were greeted by a sorry sight. A German plane had attacked the Vinga using bombs and machine guns. The ship was still floating, but it was on fire. The bridge had sustained a direct hit from a bomb, and the engine room was flooded. 8 crew members had died, including the captain. HMLMS Campbelltown and her crew had a lot of work to do in order to salvage the situation. They started off by rescuing the surviving 29 members of the Vinga's crew, who were all cramped into a single lifeboat. By the time HMS Heather arrived the following morning, the fire was under control. On the 17th, the tugboat Zwarte Zee arrived on the scene in order to tug the Vinga all the way back to Britain. The crew of HMLMS Campbelltown had successfully saved the tanker, and it survived for the remainder of the war. It seemed like afterwards it was business as usual for HMLMS Campbelltown. She returned from her final escort mission on the 20th of September 1941, having escorted 15 convoys during her time with the Dutch. The only final detail I can add is that it appears that she underwent a brief maintenance check or upgrade before being transferred back to the Royal Navy. Lieutenant William Harmson seized command of HMLMS Campbelltown on the 15th of October 1941. He was replaced on the 29th of October by Lieutenant Commander Lord Tainham Roper Curzon, who is a commissioned officer from the emergency list. Now, if you're wondering what an officer from the emergency list is, it's essentially an officer who isn't in active service, but can be called back in case of an emergency. Like, say, if the Royal Navy was short on staff, which is probably why Lord Tainham Roper Curzon ended up in charge of HMS Campbelltown. HMS Campbelltown was deployed for convoy escort duties at the end of October, very shortly before being taken in for repairs in November. Now, no convoys from that time actually list HMS Campbelltown in their logs, which leaves the cause for those repairs entirely to our very imaginative minds. You will not believe what happened in January of 1942, right? No, I'm serious, you won't believe it. HMS Campbelltown went as far as Ponta Delgada, which is on São Miguel Island belonging to Portugal, joined convoy SL-097 on the 13th of January, and left the convoy when it returned to Liverpool on the 24th, right? But that's not the impressive part, right? The impressive part is, there is no mention of a collision during that time. Do you know what that means? HMS Campbelltown successfully went on a mission under the command of the Royal Navy and didn't crash. Like, it didn't crash! Isn't that insane? I don't know if you can tell, but I've been filming for a long time. I will unfortunately have to crash the party because the plausibility of HMS Campbelltown's successful trip without crashing is kind of offset by the fact that, well, a few of the sources kind of contradict each other. For instance, on navalhistory.net, the online database, every time HMS Campbelltown crashed and had to go under repairs, the database would mention when HMS Campbelltown went into repairs and every time HMS Campbelltown left repairs. Now, during the time when HMS Campbelltown was supposedly taking part of convoy escort number SL-097, navalhistory.net claims that HMS Campbelltown was still under repairs. Now what that means essentially is that there is a chance HMS Campbelltown never went to Ponta Delgada. In other words, I cannot say with 100% certainty that, as of January 1942, the Royal Navy successfully took HMS Campbelltown on a mission without crashing her. But don't you go thinking convoy SL-097 was a good omen. Oh, no, 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 no. You sweet summer child. The Royal Navy was not done crashing her. In fact, they had yet to complete their magnum opus. You remember the SS Normandie? Yeah. Some of you can see exactly where this is going. It's time to talk about... Operation Chariot was organised in order to destroy the Louis Joubert dry dock, also known as the Saint-Nazaire dry dock, which was in, say it with me, Saint-Nazaire. The Saint-Nazaire dry dock, you might recall, was the one which was built in order to house the SS Normandie. It was the only dry dock big enough to house Germany's scariest new battleship, the Tirpitz. The Tirpitz had some truly terrifying statistics. The ship boasted multiple flak guns of varying sizes, 38cm guns, each with a range of 35 kilometers, and a top speed of 34 knots or 62 kilometers an hour. The British AOC Fire Group, or Air Officer Commanding Fire Group, described the ship as the most powerful unit of the German Navy, so it is clear that it was considered a significant threat. To get an idea of the amount of damage that the Tirpitz was capable of if she was released into the Atlantic, you only need to take a look at the amount of hassle her sister ship, the Bismarck, caused to the Royal Navy. And the Bismarck sent the Royal Navy on a huge wild goose chase across the Atlantic. Suddenly, it makes a lot more sense why the Royal Navy was obsessed with limiting the Tirpitz's access to the Atlantic. Destroying the Saint-Nazaire dry dock would achieve this. However, it wasn't easy to just waltz in and destroy the Saint-Nazaire dry dock, understandably. In order for the dry dock to be out of action for the duration of the war, they needed to destroy A, the main gates, and B, the control points and the water pumping stations. Already, destroying the main gates was going to be a huge challenge. They couldn't be destroyed using a well-placed torpedo, because submarine nets were in place. They couldn't be destroyed using bombs, because bombs simply weren't accurate enough. In fact, I have a statistic here. Only about 22% of all Allied bombs fell within 8 kilometers of their target. And that was on a good day. The Saint-Nazaire dry dock was defended by 80 anti-aircraft cannons. It was technically possible to destroy the dry docks using the cannons from a battleship at long range, or in other words, using naval bombardment. After all, the Royal Navy had perfected the art in World War I, and it was well within their range. However, there were a few difficulties here. Firstly, in order to get decent accuracy, the practice relied on the presence of scout teams on the ground, which was going to be tricky to get when the Saint-Nazaire dry dock was 10 kilometers up the Loire estuary, deep in German territory. It was also quite risky to send a battleship all the way out there. There were 32 cannons built into the Loire's northern shoreline alone. It was therefore decided that the most rational approach was to crash a ship into the dock. But which ship could possibly have the honour of making the ultimate sacrifice to destroy the Louis Joubert dry dock? Well, what about HMS Campbelltown? HMS Campbelltown was kinda growing old, kinda growing useless, and she had plenty of practice crashing into things, so it's no surprise that she was selected for the operation in January 1942. She underwent multiple modifications in order to be ready for the attack. Under the supervision of Lieutenant Nigel Tibbets, her bow was loaded with 4.25 tons of explosive amatol. This explosive amatol was fitted with a fuse, which was set to explode long after the ship crashed, thus giving the crew time to evacuate and escape. Her third and fourth funnels were removed, and the first two were modified so that she could have the silhouette of a German Moe-class torpedo boat. Some say that HMS Campbelltown was painted Mountbatten pink, a camouflage scheme which made it harder to distinguish from the sky during a sunrise or sunset. However, colour photos published by the Royal Navy do not really back this up. I mean, you could argue that's pink, but, well, at best it's a very subtle shade of pink. Some weights were also removed, like unnecessary storage room and depth charges. Analysis of before and after photos confirmed that lifeboats and torpedo tubes were removed, instead being replaced with 2 anti-aircraft cannons. Additional armour was added in order to protect the bridge. The crew size was reduced to 76 crew members for the operation. Secondary targets were selected in order to make it harder to run the nearby U-boat base. These targets include swing bridges, floodgates and artillery cannons. These secondary targets were to be destroyed by commandos who disembarked from the ship alongside the crew. They required extensive training which was supervised by Lieutenant Colonel Charles Newman. Training was done at the King George V dock in Southampton due to its striking similarity to the dry dock in Saint-Nazaire. This was important since the operation was going to take place in the dead of night, and it was unlikely that the dry dock would have access to electricity during the time of the attack. Being able to navigate the underground pump stations in complete darkness was therefore essential. By the time training was complete, the commandos were able to navigate the dock completely blindfolded. Knowing that it was nighttime, the commandos were also equipped with blue flashlights and reflective straps, presumably in order to help recognize each other. Another system put in place to help the commandos recognize each other in the dead of night in the heat of combat was the password system. In other words, if a commando wanted to verify the identity of a soldier, they simply had to say War Weapons Week. If the other person was a commando, they'd respond with Weymouth. The entire system relied on the fact that, well, German soldiers were more likely to stumble on the pronunciation of the letter W. Finally, HMS Campbelltown was given a new commander for the operation, Lieutenant Commander Stephen Haldon Beatty, who had already proven himself to be a promising commander when he was mentioned in dispatches on the 1st of January 1941 for his work on board HMS Vivian. And now the stage was set. The equipment was ready, the soldiers were ready. All they needed was the green light. Operation Chariot is probably the most well-researched part of HMS Campbelltown's history, in no small thanks to the report back to the Admiralty written on the 13th of April 1942 by Charles M. Forbes. So let's reiterate just to make sure we're all on the same page here. The plan for Operation Chariot involved driving the destroyer HMS Campbelltown 10 kilometers up the Loire estuary and crashing her into the Louis Joubert dry dock in order to destroy it. The secondary targets were water pumping stations and control points, which would help the Germans to rebuild the dry dock faster, as well as floodgates, swing bridges and artillery cannons, which were being destroyed pretty much just to annoy the soldiers in the nearby U-boat pens. HMS Campbelltown left Falmouth at 2 o'clock in the morning. She had a dangerous mission ahead of her, but she wasn't completely alone. She was to be escorted by 16 Fairmile B motor launchers, 1 Vosper 72 feet type motor torpedo boat, and 1 Fairmile C motor gunboat acting as troop headquarters. It may seem silly to bring so many plucky little coastal patrol vessels into the mission, but they did serve a purpose. They were 1. Going to land additional commandos onto the scene, and 2. They were going to bring all the soldiers back. After all, HMS Campbelltown was destined to crash into the dry dock. It's not like she was in a position to taxi all the soldiers back home, was she? Additionally, the convoy was to be escorted by 2 additional destroyers, though those destroyers were not going to make the perilous journey into the river. These destroyers were HMS Tyndale and HMS Atherstone. The convoy sailed for the rest of the evening and the entirety of the following night. By the time the sun rose on the 27th at 6 o'clock, the convoy had made their way southwest of Brittany. Since the Loire estuary was so heavily guarded by German coastal defences, the only way they could really think of to get so deep into German territory without being shot to pieces was to try and disguise themselves as a German force returning from a mission. The Royal Navy's white ensigns were taken down and the fake German Kriegsmarine flags were put up. But not all of them. You see, since HMS Tyndale and HMS Atherstone weren't expected to make the perilous journey up the Loire estuary, they weren't equipped with the fake German flags, and as a result you ended up with this suspicious convoy of both British and German vessels peacefully sailing alongside each other. Needless to say, if anyone saw them, he would, ironically, raise some red flags. It's therefore quite understandable that the convoy spent the entire day as far away from the coast as possible in a desperate attempt to avoid raising suspicions. But that doesn't mean that there weren't any close calls. At 7:20 in the morning, HMS Tyndale spotted something suspicious to the north of the convoy. She went over to investigate, and it turned out to be a German U-boat. It was decided that the German U-boat was a threat to the convoy's disguise. After all, if the German U-boat reported the position of this friendly force, and the Admiralty responded that there wasn't supposed to be any friendly force in the area, then the game would have been up. At 7:36, HMS Atherstone also left the convoy in an attempt to support HMS Tyndale, but she was very quickly distracted by 2 French civilian trawlers. Fearing that the trawlers were there to supply the U-boat, she decided the best course of action was to intercept them. Meanwhile, HMS Tyndale was still going full speed towards the enemy U-boat, which by then was becoming quite confused by the supposed friendly vessel's actions. It fired a recognition flare, but no response was given by the Royal Navy. HMS Tyndale just kept on silently approaching. By the time she reached a range of 3.5 kilometers, she raised her British flag. The U-boat immediately dived. HMS Tyndale responded by dropping her depth charges, which forced the submarine to resurface again. This gave the destroyer the opportunity to open fire with her 105mm cannons. The U-boat dived again and promptly disappeared. By then, HMS Atherstone had joined HMS Tyndale, and together they began hunting for the U-boat. For a brief moment, they managed to regain contact with the submarine using their sonar systems, although that very quickly broke up. HMS Tyndale's sonar system was reported out of action. Eventually, at 9:20, the hunt was called off, but that doesn't mean they wouldn't get a rematch. The U-boat in question, which was heading back towards Saint-Nazaire, was none other than U-boat number U-593, which HMS Tyndale would encounter for a second time on the 13th of December 1943. HMS Tyndale would not be so lucky for the second encounter, because the U-boat would end up sinking it, although the U-boat was also sunk shortly afterwards, which means that both encounters essentially resulted in a draw. But I'm kind of getting distracted here. Let's bring this back to Operation Chariot. Since the U-boat had slipped away, there were some concerns that he would make an emergency report and ruin the element of surprise. However, it is important to note that HMS Tyndale and HMS Atherstone were not supposed to escort HMS Campbelltown up the Loire estuary. Besides, they were actually a fair distance away from the convoy, meaning that, with any luck, the German U-boat commander didn't make the mental connection between the two destroyers and HMS Campbelltown. Hopefully. Either way, it's clear that the convoy was doing a terrible job at laying low, because they promptly proceeded to attack French fishing boats. In a sense, you could argue that the attacks were kind of justified, since the British officers were quite scared that French collaborators on board the fishing boats would report the location of the British vessels to German authorities. Then again, having ordered the French crews to disembark from their fishing boats, and having sunk the vessels, it is only then that the commanders found out that the French fishing boats were not equipped with radios, and this exercise was therefore entirely unnecessary. Or was it? You see, I found a report sent back to the Admiralty on the 13th of April 1942 which attempted to justify this senseless violence by saying that the whole crew appeared friendly and professed to be keen to come to England. They kindly warned the British crews of locations where they had spotted sea mines. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm quite surprised that the French fishermen were completely chill about British sailors sinking their vessels for no apparent reason. Then again, I didn't find any sources contradicting this, so I guess we're gonna have to trust this report, aren't we? At 5:18, the crew's morale took a bit of a hit. They received reports that a dangerous force of 5 torpedo boats had been sighted near Saint-Nazaire. This, needless to say, would make the mission a little more challenging. Still, they were pretty sure that they had retained the element of surprise, so they ploughed on. At 8 o'clock, the convoy started speeding up, since the light was starting to get dim, and at around 8:30, HMS Campbelltown saw her very last sunset. Interesting detail, it seems that motor launch number 341 decided to kind of ruin the moment by picking this specific instant to break down. Specifically, it suffered engine problems and was forced to turn back. I mention this because if you want to do your own research, it's useful to keep this in mind because it really messes with statistics. At 10 o'clock, things started to get serious as the convoy started getting close to the coast. They caught sight of a light from the British submarine HMS Sturgeon, which had been stationed there as a navigational marker. By this point, HMS Atherstone and HMS Tyndale decided to turn back. Their job was complete. Weather-wise, things were changing up as well. Mist was starting to come down, and visibility was becoming poor. At midnight on the 28th of March, green flashes started to appear on the horizon. The RAF had been ordered to preemptively bomb Saint-Nazaire in order to weaken defences, although, due to the aforementioned poor visibility, the crews were unable to drop their bombs. In the end, they only succeeded at just alerting the enemy, so... I mean, A for effort, I guess, but generally speaking, it isn't believed that they had a positive impact on Operation Chariot. Only 45 minutes later, the Bord de Châtelier, or Châtelier Sandbank, was sighted. This was a clear indication to the crews that they were located at the mouth of the river. HMS Campbelltown and her escort continued making their way stealthily up the Loire River, completely undetected. Or at least, that was until they reached the Balise des Moret, a navigational marker, at 1:25. After crossing the marker, HMS Campbelltown was suddenly illuminated by a searchlight from the No. 3 Heavy Coastal Battery. Suddenly, it was joined by dozens of searchlights from different parts of the shoreline. Despite this, the British were able to keep their cool. After all, they still had an ace up their sleeves. They had managed to get hold of copies of the German naval codebooks, and the Germans didn't know that. In response to the searchlights, the British responded using a signal lamp in Morse code that they were proceeding up the harbour in accordance with instruction. Many of the searchlights turned off after this message was sent. The next signal came from what the report calls the south entrance. The same response was sent, and again, they didn't open fire. It seems like they were getting away with it. Or at least, that was until suddenly HMS Campbelltown came under fire from a light flak gun. Trying to draw out the bluff for as long as possible, they sent out a message in Morse claiming to be a vessel considering herself to be fired upon by friendly forces. But would they buy it? It worked. The cannon stopped firing. According to Jeremy Clarkson's documentary, The Greatest Raid of All, it seems like HMS Campbelltown was fired upon a second time, although the report to the Admiralty which I found doesn't mention this. The convoy continued slowly making their way to the dry dock, until when they were about 2 kilometers away, an alarm was raised. And all hell broke loose. Gordon Holman, a journalist for both Reuters and the Exchange Telegraph, noted that in a second the whole river was covered with a fantastic crisscross pattern of fire, marked by the varied colour tracer shells and bullets. Corporal Robert Wright, one of the commandos on board HMS Campbelltown, said that the air was filled with things that whistled, hummed and shrieked, and every one of them were lethal. Lieutenant Corin Purdon, another commando on board HMS Campbelltown, added this: "I remember a red-hot shell passing through the wardroom just over our heads and going out, and didn't explode." Immediately after the Germans opened fire, MGB 314 spotted a flagship, probably the Sperrkretschauer 137 belonging to the 47th Minesweeper Flotilla. The flagship briefly opened fire with some of its smaller automatic weapons before it was destroyed by British pom-pom fire, pom-poms being British anti-aircraft autocannons. No one is really sure who was the helmsman of HMS Campbelltown during this charge, the helmsman being the person behind the wheel, although it's safe to assume that he was probably someone of a high rank. So it could have been perhaps a lieutenant like Christopher Gow, or a petty officer like Henry Booth or Albert Wellstead, or a leading seaman like James Smith or Ronald Bailey or Peter Morby. Whoever he was, the poor chap was almost immediately shot dead. He was replaced by someone else whose identity is also unknown, but this isn't a massive plot hole because he was also shot dead. He was then replaced by Robert Montgomery, who was a Royal Engineer and leader of the demolition teams, and was therefore completely unqualified to drive a ship. Now, luckily for Montgomery, he wasn't shot dead. Instead, he was replaced by Lieutenant Nigel Tibbets, who, you might remember, was the chap who was in charge of fitting the ship with a bomb. Despite the glare of the searchlights and the continuous stream of enemy fire, HMS Campbelltown was still making good progress towards the dry dock walls. The captain, Stephen Beatty, was able to navigate using the port entrance's lighthouses as a reference point. Or at least, he thought he was, because at the last minute the searchlights illuminated the green lighthouse, and it turns out Captain Stephen Beatty was navigating using the wrong lighthouse, the red one. All this to say, HMS Campbelltown, despite all her practice, was about to crash into the wrong target. Beatty ordered the ship to go hard to starboard. Tibbets was quick to respond, but was it too late? The ship almost hit the jetty. Almost. But they weren't out of the woods yet. A second order came. Turn hard to port. HMS Campbelltown had narrowly hit the port's maul, which is a type of jetty, but they still had to turn hard to the left in order to hit their target. Tibbets once again completed the maneuver. The ship was now aligned. Full speed ahead and brace for impact! HMS Campbelltown tore through an anti-submarine net and crashed into the dry dock walls at 1:34 in the morning. Witnesses claim they saw a brief burst of flame at the front of the ship, though that quickly died down. The captain, Stephen Beatty, turned to the crew and said, and I quote, "Well, here we are, 4 minutes late." Meanwhile, the motor gunboats were still hard at work destroying the flak guns using machine gun fire and landing commandos on the beaches. There were some losses. The Gazette's report mentions that some of the boats caught fire, others beached themselves. The situation was even worse for the crew of HMS Campbelltown, who had to dismount from the ship, which was in a very exposed position, while under heavy fire. Corporal Robert Wright recalled being knocked over by an explosion. He was helped back on his feet by Major William Copland, who was the second in command of the No. 2 Commander Division. And what he told him as he helped him up is probably my best example of just how upbeat the commanders were able to be despite how dangerous the situation was. Because he told him, and I'm not kidding here, he told him, "Don't hang about here, it's decidedly unhealthy." Lieutenant Colonel Purdon reported in an interview the state of HMS Campbelltown as they were getting off. The 12-pounder, the cannon at the bow of the ship, had been hit. There were a lot of dead bodies lying around the place, a lot of blood on the deck, and there was a hole in the deck. Lieutenant Purdon also witnessed Lieutenants Tibbets and Gow attempting to disembark from the ship using scaling ladders. Apparently, they were laughing and swearing. I'm glad they were having fun, but unfortunately it was short-lived, as they both unfortunately died shortly afterwards. Tibbets' body was never even found. The standout story here, however, is that of Lieutenant Stuart Chart. He and his team were tasked with destroying the underground pumping station. His men kept the Germans busy while he made his way down the complex arrangements of stairways and corridors in complete darkness to plant a bomb on the pumps. Now it's important to note here that some absolute buffoon decided to make Chart's life an absolute nightmare, because he was carrying preset fuses. This means that they were set in Portsmouth and he couldn't personally tamper with them on location. And this means that from the moment he ignited the fuse, he had 90 seconds until the bomb detonated. And keep in mind that during this time, he was meant to navigate his way out of the maze that was the underground pumping station in complete darkness. To make matters worse, Chant was seriously wounded. He had sustained an injury to the left knee, the right arm, and both hands due to shrapnel. Somehow, by some absolute miracle, the absolute legend still managed to make it out without exploding himself. Meanwhile, Commander-in-Chief Charles Forbes had disembarked from his motor gunboat and was inspecting the damaged hull of HMS Campbelltown. The crew had already abandoned the ship, but he still needed to make sure that the bombs on board were intact. He had brought a torpedo boat in case the bombs on board HMS Campbelltown were damaged by the journey, but everything seemed a-okay, and so he ordered the torpedo boat to go attack a secondary target, the port's old entrance gates. The old entrance gates were one of the 2 exits available to U-boats in order to enter and exit the port, so it was a pretty important target. The torpedo boat successfully fired 2 time-delayed torpedoes before it itself was sunk by German coastal batteries. And unfortunately, it wasn't the only one. It's important to understand that the small motorboats selected for the operation were poorly picked, to say the least. They were small, better suited for coastal patrols, made of wood, and worst of all, were fitted with external fuel tanks. Now, you don't need to be a genius to understand that mixing wood, petrol, and bullets was going to result in a poor performance. Almost all of the motor gunboats caught fire, and since the element of surprise was dissipating and the enemy was starting to reorganize, things began to get quite tough. The motor gunboats began to struggle to silence the fire from the shore, and since their decks were starting to fill up with wounded soldiers, eventually they were forced to retreat. This was pretty bad news for the commandos who, having destroyed their targets on the shore, were supposed to meet up at the old mall to rendezvous for evacuation. Needless to say, they very quickly understood that there was very little chance of them being able to make it back. Gordon Holman described a scene of blazing destruction which reminded one of the worst London Blitz nights, while Lance Corporal Eric de la Tour described how chaps were drowning. There were pools of burning fuel on the water. Now, you may think that the situation was hopeless, and in a sense it kind of was, but you'd be forgetting a key factor. These were commandos, not commandants. They were extremely confident, their morale was unbreaking, and they knew to push themselves to their limits. They very quickly came up with a bold new plan, which involved, and I'm not kidding here, fighting their way through the entirety of Saint-Nazaire, escaping to the countryside, making their way through the entirety of France and Spain, all the way to Gibraltar, which was still under British control. This still meant completing step 1 of the plan, which involved, escaping Saint-Nazaire, which was already a really challenging step because they were effectively trapped on an island, with the Loire River on one side and the Saint-Nazaire Basin on the other. In order to access the mainland, the commandos decided to make a daring charge across one of the port's turn bridges, which was both exposed and under heavy fire. It was a suicidal task, so naturally they succeeded, and spent the remainder of the night evading German soldiers in the town. Unfortunately, though they were able to escape the port, they were unable to escape their fate, as most of the commandos were either captured, wounded, or both. Mind you, 5 commandos did manage to escape into the countryside and proceeded to make the roughly 1,400 kilometer trek all the way to Gibraltar. I wish I knew more about their story, because it must have been wild. As you can see, sources greatly contradict each other when it comes to the number of soldiers involved, captured, and killed. However, I will personally side with the official report to the Admiralty, which states that of the 621 soldiers who departed, only 218 returned. Of the 403 men who didn't return, 5 evaded capture and approximately 169 died, meaning that 229 were captured. The statistics regarding the specific number of ships lost are equally vague. According to the report to the Admiralty, HMS Campbelltown was escorted into the estuary by 18 coastal craft. Of these 18 coastal craft, only 7 made it back out, and of these 7, only 3 were in a good enough shape to make the return journey. This means that, including motor launch number 341, which turned back due to engine problems, only 4 ships made it back from the operation. Whether they made the return journey or not, the men involved were heralded as heroes back at home. A staggering 5 Victoria Crosses were awarded after the event, which is, I believe, the most Victoria Crosses ever awarded in a single military event. These Victoria Crosses were awarded to Commander Robert Edward Dudley Ryder for staying in the thick of battle for 1 hour and 16 minutes to coordinate the evacuation. He was one of the few to successfully escape through the barrage of enemy fire in a boat manned mostly by dead and wounded soldiers. Able seaman William Alfred Savage also won an award for continuously firing at enemy positions using the motor launches on board pom-pom gun, despite being in an extremely exposed position. He was shot dead during the retreat. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Augustus Newman, who had coordinated the training of the commandos, won an award for his impressive dedication as commander. He reportedly was one of the first to land on the port and proceeded to make sure that the demolition teams had sufficient covering fire, coordinating a mortar strike on an enemy emplacement on the U-boat pens and machine gunning an armed trawler in the harbour. He also coordinated the attempted escape through the town, personally clearing out several houses occupied by enemy forces before he was eventually captured. Lieutenant Commander Stephen Haldon Beatty was given an award for his ability to navigate HMS Campbelltown into the dry dock walls, despite the glare of the searchlights and the intense enemy fire. Finally, Sergeant Thomas Frank Durrant was given an award for his frankly insane bravery manning the Lewis gun aboard ML306. Despite being in a completely unprotected position, he continuously fired upon the enemy forces, even though he was shot 16 times. His boat was in tatters, all other gun positions were destroyed, and the commander of the German destroyer repeatedly asked for the crew of the motor launch to surrender. He kept firing until he passed out from blood loss. He unfortunately did not survive his wounds, but the commander of the German destroyer personally asked for Durrant to be awarded the Victoria Cross, and when your enemy personally asks for you to be awarded the highest honour, you know you've done something brave. It's now the morning of the 28th of March 1942. Lieutenant Commander Stephen Haldon Beatty was one of the many captured during the operation. He later recalled in an interview how he was questioned by the Germans the following morning. Supposedly, the German officer was remarking just how futile the operation was. After all, it was no good ramming a stout caisson like that with such a flimsy ship. And it was at that exact moment that it happened. HMS Campbelltown detonated sometime around 10:30 on the 28th of March 1942, killing all the German trophy hunters unfortunate enough to be near the wreck at the time of the incident. The specific number of German and French casualties is unknown. The date of repair of the Louis Joubert dry dock is a surprisingly debated topic. According to my research, the Louis Joubert dry dock was only repaired in 1947 and only resumed normal service in 1948. It is still in use to this day. The Tirpitz was denied access to the Atlantic, forcing it to remain hidden in Norwegian fjords until it was capsized in a joint operation by the RAF No. 9 Squadron and 617 Squadron. The bombs used were tallboy bombs, which was a very special kind of bomb. Weighing 5,443 kilograms, it was designed to be dropped from roughly 5,500 meters in height, giving it enough kinetic energy to burrow into the ground, or alternatively, penetrate thick concrete. Once it was buried in the ground, it proceeded to detonate, generating a massive, destructive shockwave. These bombs were so big that the Lancaster bomber could only carry one bomb, meaning that precision bombing was key, which was not easy to do when your bomb sight looked like this. It took the RAF 3 attempts to destroy the Tirpitz with the tallboys. The first time, the Germans deployed a smokescreen which hid the ship from the bomb aimers. The second time, the Tirpitz was hidden by thick cloud cover. And finally, they landed 2, possibly 3, direct hits on the Tirpitz. The pride of the German Navy didn't get a single opportunity to see action. 5 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the US government officially seized the SS Normandie, intending to turn the ship into a troop transport. During the conversion process into the troop transport, tragedy struck. On the 9th of February 1942, the flammable life vests on board the ship were ignited by the sparks from a worker's welding torch. Now, the SS Normandie was equipped for such an eventuality. It was equipped with some of the most advanced fire suppression systems of the time. Unfortunately, due to the ongoing repairs, said fire suppression system had been disconnected. Thankfully, there was a backup plan. The New York City firefighters were called in, but unfortunately, they didn't bring their own water. Standard practice for the time involved firefighters bringing their own hoses to the scene of the fire, whereupon they would attach said fire hoses to a water supply point, usually a fire hydrant, which would provide them with the water they needed to fight the fire. Now, the SS Normandie did have onboard water pumping stations and fire hose connections, but unfortunately said fire hose connections were not compatible with the New York City firefighters' fire hoses, which means that they could not acquire the water required to put out the fire on the ship. The fire was still raging when Vladimir Yurkovich, the ship's designer, turned up, but unfortunately all he could do was helplessly watch as the SS Normandie capsized in New York Harbor's Pier 88. Now, the events in this documentary have not exactly portrayed him in a particularly positive manner, but it's important to note that Mr. Below was not entirely hopeless. In fact, his story is ultimately an inspiring story of redemption. Firstly, I feel I should point out that while Lieutenant Below did rather impressively manage to crash his ship multiple times in a very short span of time, it is important to note that in his defense, HMS Campbelltown did have a reputation for having a poor low-speed maneuverability and a large turning circle. Then again, this argument is kind of hurt by the fact that, well, the Dutch Navy never crashed her, so perhaps it was a skill issue. Despite the absolute nightmare that was his time as commander of HMS Campbelltown, the Royal Navy still trusted his skills. Almost immediately after severely damaging his first destroyer, he was put in charge of HMS Vanity, a ship upon which he served until June of 1941, being promoted, yes, promoted to Lieutenant Commander during his stay. He was also put in charge of HMS Cotton, upon which he got the Distinguished Service Cross for destroying 3 U-boats in the Kola Inlet in April 1945. On the 3rd of September 1945, he was then put in charge of HMS Contest, upon which he served until the 10th of November 1946. After the war, Lieutenant Commander Below continued to rise up in the ranks. In 1946, he became a commander. In 1951, he became a captain. In 1957, he became a commodore. And in 1963, he became a vice admiral. But it doesn't end there. In 1963, he became a Knight Commander of the Most Honourable Order of the Bath, and in 1965, he became a Knight of the Order of the British Empire. Yes, you heard me correctly. That same Lieutenant Below we all know and love got a knighthood. Unfortunately, Vice Admiral Below never got to retire. He died of a heart attack in 1966 in his car, as he was leaving to attend a church service. Stephen Haldon Beatty was ultimately captured during Operation Chariot. He was briefly sent to the prisoner of war camp Frontstalag 133 in Rennes before being transferred to Marlag and Milag Nord in North Germany. He survived the war and was freed by friendly forces on the 10th of April 1945. On top of his Victoria Cross, his actions on board HMS Campbelltown earned him a series of other prestigious awards, including the French Légion d'honneur, the French Croix de Guerre, and a promotion to commander. He continued serving in the army until July of 1960, when he retired, having achieved the rank of captain. Captain Stephen Haldon Beatty has been buried in the St. Brown Churchyard, Cornwall, since 1975, near the tomb of his wife, Philippa Beatty. HMS Campbelltown has two real legacies: a physical legacy in terms of whatever's left of it, and the cultural legacy, which is the impact it had culturally. I'm going to start with the cultural legacy because it's actually quite short and simple to explain. There's only really one film which talks about the operation and what went down here at Saint-Nazaire, and that is The Gift Horse, or depending on where you look it up, it can also be called Glory at Sea. Don't know much about it, but I can tell you that it stars Richard Attenborough. Yes, that's Richard Attenborough, the one who directed A Bridge Too Far and who starred in the Jurassic Park trilogy. Moving on to the physical remnants of the operation, there are of course the numerous bits and bobs which were left after the ship exploded, most of which, that still remain to this day, are recovered thanks to the help of the German trophy hunters before the ship exploded. One such component was the bell, which was gifted to Campbelltown, Pennsylvania in 1950, in honor of the Destroyers for Bases agreement. It stayed there for a fair amount of time until the Royal Navy started developing the newest of their line, the Type 22 frigate, in 1987, which they called HMS Campbelltown. That ship, in honor of that ship, the bell was loaned back to the Royal Navy, where it was kept until 2011. That's when the ship was decommissioned. After which, the bell was put on display in Campbelltown, Scotland, for a few days, before being returned once again to Campbelltown, Pennsylvania, where it remains to this day. Other components were found over the years, bits and bobs, such as this cannon from the front of the ship. It was found in 1978, March of 1978, during a dredging operation by some workers. Other components have been found as well. We have the bulkhead door, number 6, which was found in almost 80 years after the operation occurred. It had been blown off. It was part of the superstructure at the front, blown off over in this direction by the explosion. It was found roughly 100 meters from the detonation point. And then finally, there's a piece of crumpled up wreckage found from what we presume to be the hull, which was found in 2020 by the electricity company EDF France. They were planning to build a wind farm out at sea in that direction, and they were doing some preamble work in the dock in order to prepare for that construction project. We can actually see some of the components for the wind farm over there. The piece of wreckage was found 30 meters out in the water under 20 centimeters of silt. It was catapulted a heck of a long way. Although it has yet to be 100% confirmed whether it belongs to the ship. That being said, it's currently being held, as far as I know, by the Commando Association, who plan to build a museum, so it looks like HMS Campbelltown's story has yet to be fully completed.